Hello there everyone. We are starting Unit 4, and with Unit 4 the first lesson, 4.01, A War of Words and Ideas. And here's the introduction to Unit 4. World War II transformed the United States into the world's wealthiest and most powerful nation, but that position meant new responsibility. The dangers of the atomic age were enormous, and the tension between communist and democratic countries threatened the very existence of humankind. At home, though, life for most Americans was good. New technologies, new trends, new music. The 50s were fabulous. But beneath the surface, inequality and poverty still plagued millions of people whose American dream was still unfulfilled. The movement for civil rights was about to begin. And that just gives me goosebumps. That just seems so powerful and exciting. Lesson 1, A War of Words and Ideas. At the end of the most devastating war in history brought enormous relief, but there was no time to relax. Cities, industries, and farms throughout Europe and parts of Asia lay in ruin, and millions of people were homeless. In the USSR, Joseph Stalin broke his promise to pull out of Eastern Europe, and communism loomed across the continent. Would the United States turn back to isolationism? How long would European recovery take? Was it possible to defeat communism? How could the United States and other democracies keep communism from spreading to more and more countries? There were no easy answers, but the United States was now a superpower and had to act. Goals for this lesson. Describe the beginning of the Cold War in Iron Curtain. Identify major goals and examples of alliances and containment policy actions. And recognize the key issues of the election of 1948 and its outcome. Remember to grab your reading guide and lesson answer key. There's also another resource, the Berlin Airlift, you might want to grab right away as well. And we are going to read by reading pages 748 through 759. So let me write that down. And we shall begin. 748. And this is just the beginning of the chapter, The Cold War at Home and Abroad. And we see on this page, this is a picture of the mushroom cloud when the atomic bomb was dropped on in Japan. The Cold War at Home and Abroad. Early in 1945, even before World War II ended, confident Allied leaders began to plan the shape of a post-war world. The Big Three, President Franklin Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin, met at Yalta, a resort in the Black Sea in Central Europe. Their purpose was to discuss the future of Europe and the world after the war. At Yalta, the Big Three met as allies, but in the back of their minds, they knew the alliance might not last. Among their many differences, the sharpest was this. The United States and Britain were democracies that embraced capitalism, while the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. The United States and Britain hoped for greater democracy throughout Europe, while Stalin hoped to extend his nation's communist influence, particularly in Eastern Europe. At Yalta, the Big Three agreed in principle to divide Germany into 4 zones to be occupied by the Allied powers. Stalin agreed to free elections in Soviet-occupied countries, a promise he would fail to keep. He also pledged the Soviet Union would cooperate in forming a new international organization to help maintain peace after the war. The leaders decided to sort out the details at a later summit to be held in Potsdam, Germany. At this later meeting, the United States was represented by its new president, Harry Truman. And here we have a picture of the Big Three there in Yalta. This is Winston Churchill on the left, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR in the middle, and Stalin on the far right. This was shortly before FDR passed away. World War II was scarcely over when a deep rift split the victorious Allies. Old suspicions flared into tense distrust. Leaders of the Soviet Union suspected the United States of trying to dominate the world for the benefit of capitalists. American leaders believed the Soviets were trying to forge a worldwide communist society ruled by a totalitarian dictatorship based in Moscow. Over the next 40 years, many other nations would be drawn to the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the world's 2 superpowers. On one side the West, or Western Bloc, made up of the United States and its allies, and on the other side the East, or Eastern Bloc, on the communist nations led by the Soviet Union. American troops would fight wars in Korea and Vietnam against communist forces supported by the Soviet Union. But because no hot or shooting war ever broke out between the Soviet Union and the United States, their long intense conflict is known as the Cold War. And let's look at this political cartoon. It says, 1951 political cartoon depicts the Soviets spreading dominance of Eastern Europe and Asia. So we have the red cape to symbolize the communism, red because of their flag. And then we have all these countries, part of Eastern Europe, and then down in here China is in Asia, that became communist. Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, Tibet, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, China. And showing the cape of the Soviet Union covering the globe. The Cold War begins. The Second World War devastated much of Europe and Asia. By the time it ended in August 1945, it had cost an estimated 60 million lives. In the war's aftermath, great cities lay in ruins. Millions of homeless survivors suffered from malnutrition and disease. An American diplomat wrote that in Berlin, the conquered capital of Germany, the odor of death was everywhere. He could as well have been describing dozens of other cities in Europe and Asia. Around the world, people longed for peace. Many took hope from the founding of the United Nations 2 months after the war's end. Like the old League of Nations, this organization was designed to prevent future wars by promoting cooperation among countries. But hopes for peace brought new anxieties. The United States and the Soviet Union, former allies who had emerged from the war as the world's most powerful nations, were increasingly at odds. And the United States possessed the most terrible weapon the world had ever seen, the atomic bomb. After the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin remarked, "War is barbaric, but using the A-bomb is super barbarity." To maintain a balance of power with America, or such was the reason he gave, Stalin ordered his scientists to develop an atomic weapon of their own. The descent of the Iron Curtain. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet Union tightened its grip on the nations of Eastern Europe. The Soviets had driven Nazi troops out of Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. But instead of making good on its promise at Yalta to let these nations hold free elections and establish democratic governments, Stalin imposed communist, pro-Soviet regimes in these lands, as well as in the eastern part of Germany. To many Americans and Western Europeans, these actions seemed nakedly aggressive. Soviet leaders countered that they needed a buffer to protect themselves against future aggression from the West. This is important to note here, a buffer region. After all, Germany's invasion of the USSR had taken an enormous human and economic toll. More than 1 million Russians died in the German siege of Leningrad, while the Battle of Stalingrad, at least 1 million Soviet soldiers died, as well as an untold number of civilians. The Soviets, fearing the potential power of a nuclear United States and its Western allies, insisted they needed a sphere of influence to safeguard their interests. One of those most dismayed by Soviet actions was Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime prime minister. In March 1946, in a speech to an American audience, he declared, "An iron curtain has descended across Europe. Behind this iron curtain lay the nations conquered by the Soviet Union. The democracies of Western Europe," Churchill said, "must band together with the United States to resist further Soviet expansion." Churchill warned that if the free nations of the world failed to halt Soviet aggression, catastrophe may overwhelm us all. As the Cold War deepened, American leaders continued to refer to an iron curtain to describe the dividing line between a Soviet-dominated communist East and a capitalist democratic West. The Truman Doctrine and the Policy of Containment. In February 1946, George F. Kennan, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, sent a dramatic 5,000-word telegram to his bosses at the State Department. In this so-called long telegram, Kennan warned that the Soviet Union had become a dangerous expansionist state. Soviet leaders, he explained, had convinced their people of the hostility of the outside world, especially from the United States, because it was the only way they could justify the harshness of their rule at home and their desire to spread communism abroad. Therefore, no friendly gestures by the West would have any effect on the Soviet Union. All the United States could do, Kennan argued, was stand firm against Soviet aggression. The following year, Kennan wrote an article in which he called for a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. His ideas deeply influenced American leaders. American foreign policy throughout the Cold War would follow Kennan's strategy of containment, preventing the expansion of communism, especially by strengthening non-communist countries bordering the Soviet Union. Even before Kennan coined the term, Truman's administration had moved to contain the Soviet Union. In early 1947, the Soviets appeared ready to invade Greece and Turkey in an attempt to extend their sphere of influence to the eastern Mediterranean. In March of that year, President Truman asked Congress for $400 million in aid for both countries. To begin his request by drawing a stark contrast between the Western way of life based on freedom and the communist way of life based on terror and oppression. Then he declared, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure." The President's policy, which became known as the Truman Doctrine, committed the United States to the containment of communism wherever it threatened to spread. Some objected to Truman's plan. They believed that the problems in Greece and Turkey could be solved through diplomatic means at the United Nations. Others, remembering World War II, still thought of the Soviet Union as an ally, not a hostile power that had to be contained. Truman, however, was firmly resolved to stop communism, while Stalin was single-mindedly determined to spread it. The Marshall Plan. Truman and other Western leaders understood that Soviet armies were not the only threat to peace and stability. 2 years after the end of World War II, the continent of Europe remained, in Winston Churchill's words, a rubble heap, a charnel house, a breeding ground for pestilence and hate. Churchill remembered how in the years after World War I, poverty and chaos had encouraged the rise of nationalistic dictatorships that provoked a more terrible war. He feared that harsh post-war conditions would once again give rise to extremist forces on the right and left. Truman too worried that desperate people might embrace communism, and he was committed to preventing the outcome. In June of 1947, Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, proposed a plan for rebuilding war-torn Europe. Marshall, a retired general, had served as U.S. Army Chief of Staff during the war. Churchill called him the true organizer of victory. In his European recovery program, Marshall promoted a stable peace let's get to the right page. A stable peace of a massive infusion of American aid to rebuild the shattered economies of Europe. Though some Americans attacked the proposal as a wasteful giveaway, Congress quickly adopted the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided $13 billion in economic aid to Europe. The Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites were included in the American aid. But Stalin, who saw the Marshall Plan as a plot to spread American influence and divide the Eastern Bloc, refused to take part. The Marshall Plan became one of the most successful programs in the history of U.S. foreign policy. By funneling much-needed economic assistance to the nations of Southern and Western Europe, along with food, fuel, machinery, and technical assistance, the plan helped bring about a stunning economic recovery. Everywhere, cities, roads, farms, and factories rebuilt and modernized. By 1952, European productivity in both industry and agriculture had soared well above its pre-war levels. In countries such as Britain, France, and Italy, the United States earned enormous goodwill. The Marshall Plan brought political stability to the continent, and in helping Europe get back on its feet, America ensured its own prosperity by exporting goods to the newly prosperous Europeans. On the picture here on the left, the caption says, "Under the Marshall Plan, the United States provided billions of dollars in aid to help build war-torn Europe." And we see here a mess of bricks being rebuilt, a building there. Let's flip back to the previous page, and it's just that excerpt from the Truman Doctrine. On March 12, 1947, Truman addressed the U.S. Congress. He asked Congress to approve aid to Greece and Turkey, which was under threat from communist forces. He also articulated a policy that became known as the Truman Doctrine. And you can read through that on your own. It just is an excerpt from his speech, so it would be a primary source. All right. Motivations, and actually I'm going to stop here at Motivation of the Marshall Plan, and we'll continue that on the next video.